Before we begin, know that I still have 2 codes to give away for Beneath Oresa, one of the better games actually, that we are going to be talking about today. If you are interested in fetching one of those 2 codes, check out the timestamp for the game for further instructions. So, I saw this video titled Ranking the Best and Worst Roguelite Games on Cannot Be Tainted's channel, and I thought,
I gotta do one of those.
I'll leave a link to that video in the description section down below, because there are a couple of titles there that I am sure you are going to want to check out. But for my own video, I thought I'd narrow down that list to card battlers. And I also thought I'd include all card battlers and card battler adjacent games, regardless of whether they are roguelite or roguelikes or the good old save scum friendly model, etc. Why? Well, I think that if you're interested in a game, because it belongs in X or Y genre, you're not going to care as much, I think, if it's a roguelike or a roguelite or a regular save and restore game. I think that roguelike and roguelite at this point are terms that belong in their own taxonomy, but not necessarily within the genre taxonomy. So what about those card battler adjacent games that I mentioned? What are those, you wonder? Well, for this video, card battler adjacent games means those games that are card games that offer an experience comparable, let's say, to that of a card battler, which means that they challenge your tactical and strategic skills, they involve some form of deck building, and said deck is used for combat encounters, but they aren't card battlers exactly. Yes? This means that games like Mao Kenshi or Gloomhaven are going to sit this one out. And it also means that I am not including trading card games like Gwent, in any of its presentations of course, Hearthstone, amongst other things because I have not played it, and Magic the Gathering. I think that those belong in their own list. I also think a little bit of segmentation is in order here, because not all of these games were designed to appeal to the same types of players. This is something that I have noticed playing these many games. So I have come up with a completely arbitrary player taxonomy for this video, and I'm gonna share it with you before we start. First, you have the Ryu players. Who are the Ryu players? Why do I call them Ryu players? Well, do you remember in Street Fighter 2 when you beat the game with Ryu, and the narrator said something like, "As the award ceremony starts, the crowd can be heard calling for Ryu, where's the champion?" or something like that. And then he went on to say, "Already seeking the next challenge, because ceremony means nothing to him, the fight is everything." Well, some card battler enthusiasts are like that. For these people, games like Slay the Spire start once they have defeated the Heart of the Spire with all the characters. These people are all about ascension levels, covenant levels, impossible handicaps that you can only overcome if you have a deep understanding of the game's strategic and tactical dimensions, etc. These people don't give a shit about the stories, secondary mechanics. For them, all that shit is fat that needs to be trimmed. That's why these guys and gals prefer encounter-based games rather than story-driven games, when it comes to card battlers, that is. But then you have the filthy normies, which are basically the exact opposite of Ryu's. For them, the game is over when the final boss dies for the first time. When that happens, on to the next game. And games that frame combat encounters as something that you need to do in order to advance further into the story, and games that throw in RPG elements into the gameplay mix, are always going to be better received by these players than those that are strictly about combat. They don't want their tactical and strategic skills challenged to the point of frustration. And many of them are going to say the game is unbalanced, or that it has a huge difficulty spike when the shit gets serious. Although that is not always the case. In fact, that's rarely the case, but that's neither here nor there. And then you have the filthy mediums. People who like a good challenge and are not against investing months of their time to get halfway through an ascension ladder with progressive handicaps, but can also appreciate a good story-driven game with a more varied gameplay mix. So there you have it, those are the 3 different types of players that I have identified and the games that they are usually more interested in. And I'm going to be mentioning these things whenever I think it's necessary, which is not going to be always, probably. So we have 28 titles to go through, so let's get to it. The first one is Acolyte of the Altar. This one is a little bit different from your average card battler when it comes to its mechanics. In this game, you don't drag cards from your hand and onto enemies, as is the case with most of the games on this list. You play your cards on a board and then declare your attackers, which means that some creatures can attack and some creatures can defend. And if there are no creatures to take the damage from enemy attacks, then the player takes the damage. So to me, this game feels a little bit like a single-player Magic the Gathering. But subscriber Rygor over on Discord during one of our Card Battler Saturday meetings said that the game felt more like Hearthstone. By the way, you're all invited to come over to Card Battler Saturday on Discord every Saturday at 4 p.m. -4 GMT. Well, Rygor said that this game was actually a shameless copycat of Hearthstone. I believe those were his exact words, except for the theme. But speaking of the theme, I actually really dig the premise of this game. There are 3 larger-than-life, extremely badass gods who are fighting for supremacy over the world in which the game takes place. But they don't duke it out with each other because that would result in the complete annihilation of the planet. So instead, they leave it to these also larger-than-life kaijus to beat the shit out of each other to determine which god deserves to be the sole ruler of the planet. So it's a Shadow of the Colossus card battler kind of deal. And you play the role of a powerful acolyte with untold magical powers who has pledged his allegiance to one or two of these gods and is now ready to take on these mighty kaijus. And I think this premise is awesome, but I also think it falls painfully short of living up to its full potential. I mean, these creatures are meant to be frightening, huge, larger than life, but you see them through this tiny little window in the upper part of your screen. And I think it should have been something like the Salutor fights in the Thaumaturge. Imagine what it would have been like if it had been something like this. As for the gameplay, at the beginning of the game you can choose a single god, or a primary and a secondary god. And I felt like every god had interesting cards with moderately interesting synergies, but I found it a little bit frustrating that there weren't any cool cross-god synergies. The game itself is encounter-based, and every encounter feels like a boss fight, and I like that. However, there's nothing more to this game other than its combat encounters. You have random events, but they feel like they are there to tick a box because other games have them. They feel completely detached from the deck building aspect of the game. They're not like the ones in Beneath Oresa or Slay the Spire. In those games, you really have to take those random events into account for your strategic planning. Also, the game does not have any form of progressive challenge. Once you beat the game, there's basically no reason to come back to it, other than maybe finish the game again with a different combination of gods or something. And finally, the regular price for this game, in my region at least, is $19.99. And for that price, you can buy 2 or 3 much better games from this list. So this one is going to go into the meh tier. Our first game goes into the meh tier. Next is Across the Obelisk. This is probably going to be the first hot take of the night, or noon, or morning, or whatever time it is now in your country, but I didn't like this one at all. And it's basically because this game rewards you more for playing the game than for actually getting good at it. The same tactics that can barely get you through the first boss during the first few hours will be enough for you to beat the game entirely once you've spent 30 or 40 hours on the game. And it's basically because by that time you will have taken advantage of the game's grossly overpowered meta progression. Town upgrades, talent trees, cards, etc. The cards per se are also nothing to write home about. They aren't. They do the typical basic things they always do in these games: damage, block, do more damage if the target is afflicted by such and such, damage over time, etc. Subscriber Pablo Castañeda over on Discord said that this game is actually fun to play with some friends, because it is a party-based game, and each of your friends gets to play as one of the characters and use his or her deck however you wish, and I can see the appeal of that. Also, this game features probably the best map that I've seen in any of these card battlers. It's not only beautifully designed, but it's also filled with adventure-y events. There are some nodes that are self-contained dungeons with their own self-contained stories and unlockable NPCs that you can recruit for future runs, etc. Pretty cool. But playing the game itself feels frustrating because its meta progression features are just too OP, and they make the game almost pointless to play, at least as a single-player campaign. So for me, Accross the Obelisk is going to go into the bad tier. I know that a lot of people probably not going to agree with me, but I just didn't like it, and this is my list. Need I remind you? Ash of the Gods: The Way is up next. This game is not really a card battler. It's more like one of those card battler adjacent games that I mentioned, and it features the most ridiculous premise for a story that I have ever seen. And spoiler alert, there is a porn game on this list, and the story premise in Ash of the Gods is probably worse than the one in that game. That should tell you all you need to know. As for the gameplay cycle, you have combat encounters in this game, but the game really wants to sell you the story as the one thing that's supposed to get you invested in the whole deal. And at least for me, it failed miserably. The encounters themselves are more like puzzles. In some sense, this game is more like a puzzle game masquerading as a card battler. You do have a deck, and there are turns, and you draw cards from your deck every turn, but the challenges are about figuring out how to undo the enemy's advantage more than they are about surviving or out-damaging the opponents. And there are some units that are better suited for some puzzles, but there's no way of knowing how to build your deck in an optimal way until you have fought and presumably lost the encounter. I do like, however, that you can beat any, in theory, that you can beat any encounter even if your deck isn't fully optimized for the challenge at hand. I think that's pretty cool. Some other games on this list, like Cobalt Core, also feature puzzle-like encounters, but they all revolve around the same basic set of rules. But that's not the case with Ash of the Gods, or Ash of the Gods: The Way, because this is a spin-off of Ash of the Gods, which is a game that belongs into a different genre or something. I'm not familiar with it, to be honest. But this one is constantly explaining what needs to be done. The winning conditions of the encounter, how to play your cards, and it even suggests the best strategy to accomplish this. And I found this unbearably tedious. Add that on top of a childish premise for a story, over-the-top cringe dialogue, and the fact that some characters have abysmal voice acting, and you have a game that's thoroughly deserving, in my opinion, of being on the bad tier. Despite its admittedly good production values, this game looks pretty, the animations are pretty cool, the graphics are cool, it has a strong artistic vision, but no way. No way, Jose. This one's going into the bad tier. I couldn't even finish it. I couldn't even go past the tournament. That's how boring. And the tournament takes place almost at the beginning of the game. So that's how boring this game is. Coming up next is Balatro, the game that everyone and their moms are talking about. Maybe because it is for moms. No, not really. This is a deceitfully robust deck building game. It's not exactly a card battler. It's more like a card battler adjacent game, but it does feature a lot of deck building, and the game's encounters, they aren't really encounters, but the game's games, yes, require you to approach the deck building aspect of the game with a strategic mindset. See, at its very core, it is a poker game, but with one hell of a twist. The different poker hands that you play, you know, 2 of a kind, 3 of a kind, 2 pair, full house, flush, straights, etc. These are the different plays that you have at your disposal, and you can upgrade them in various ways. You have jokers, which work like relics in Slay the Spire, that give you permanent bonuses and boons, and it's super cool to make them work together. There are some pretty badass synergies that you can achieve with them. For example, there's this one joker that turns all your cards into phase cards, and then you have this other joker that adds an additional multiplier factor to all phase cards. And then you have planet cards, which are really flat increment upgrades that you can add to the different poker hands that you can play. So for example, you can decide that you want to build your strategy around the 2-pair hand. So you always go for the planet card that upgrades the 2-pair hand. And of course, you pair that up with the jokers that benefit the 2-pair hand the most. So it's actually pretty strategic and tactical. But it does have one problem, and I think that Pam nailed it on her video. She said that this game is more addictive than it is fun. I think those were her exact words, and I concur. At the end of the day, you're not fighting monsters or just to make it out alive of your current predicament. You're trying to beat a number with poker cards, and that's kind of sucky. Also, the game's lowliest achievement takes way too much time to complete. We're talking about your typical beat the final boss for the first time on the standard difficulty level. In most of the games on this list, you can achieve this within a few hours of gameplay. But in Balatro, this feels like it takes forever. And it's not particularly rewarding when it happens. Many times I felt like I was being challenged, but I was never really having a blast with this game. I will say this though, this is the perfect game for those times in which you are sitting around, not really wanting to play anything, but also not really wanting to do anything else. I think this is the perfect game for those situations. But it's not enough for me to place it any higher than the meh tier, so that's where it's going to go. Then we have Beneath Oresa. This is one of the best card battlers on this list, and it's one of the best card battlers that I've ever played, really. This game may not be the best in every respect, but the cards themselves, in terms of their tactical possibilities and their synergies, are the best. Second to none on this list, and I do mean this. You have 3 different factions, each of which have their own unique mechanics, and these are not your typical run-of-the-mill mechanics. You really need to wrap your head around what each of these mechanics entail and how to play your game to make the most out of them. And then each faction has its own champions that have their own approach to the faction's main mechanics, which basically means that each champion is unique. And then on top of that, you can choose a companion, which is a feature that allows you to hone your playstyle to your own liking even more. This is a game for reuse though, make no mistake about it. This game is not about the story or the characters, though it does have these elements, but it's all about its combat encounters and the challenge that they will throw at you. So you should absolutely keep this in mind. Also, this game has some of the most amazing production values that I've ever seen on a card game. It features some of the best animations that I've ever seen, it has a strong, cohesive artistic vision, and the UI is impeccable. So if you want to know more about this game, click on the link to its review in the description section down below, or if you have already decided that this is for you and you want to give it a shot, click on the Discord link down below and send me a direct message with the name of the card that you see on your screen in this very moment. As you might have guessed by now, Beneath Oresa is going to go in the Great tier. First game that we have in the Great tier. And then we have Black Book. This is a game for filthy normies and filthy mediums. I don't see this game being one that the Ryus are going to oh boy and oh wow about. But I'm digging this game right now like you wouldn't believe. This game is, let's say, deceitfully reminiscent of The Witcher. I'm obviously not talking about the production values. You can obviously tell by the footage that it doesn't look like The Witcher at all, of course. But this game kept bringing back memories from The Witcher at every turn. You are a witch who lives in a town in the ass end of nowhere, somewhere in Russia around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And folk from around town and from other towns come to ask you to help them out with their otherworldly demonic problems. And these jobs feel like Witcher contracts, because they are heavily rooted in Eastern European folklore and ancient superstition, and you have to deal with them with all manners of rituals and obscure magic. And there's a lot of lore in this game that adds to the immersion factor. It makes you feel like you are a part of the world, a world that's fascinating. And you as a player probably know very little about it if you're not from those parts, so I think this is pretty cool. This game has an overarching story, fascinating mini-quests. It features companions of sorts who tag along for the ride and even have talents that can help you out in combat. You also have dialogue options that reward you for paying attention to what's going on in the game. Many of these dialogue sequences are like tests of your knowledge of Russian folklore, but if you have been paying attention, and if you have been reading the codex entries, you should have no problem navigating these situations successfully. But don't get it wrong, I know that it makes it sound like the game forces you to read codex entries to get through the game's objectives. But these codex entries and these pieces of lore feel more like these pieces of lore that are lying around in Trials of the Lure Master, the expansion to Heart of Winter, which is in turn an expansion to Icewind Dale. In that game, you have pieces of lore lying about that you read out of your own volition. And when you read these pieces of lore, you also come to realize that they have clues about what you need to do next and how. And it's the same with Black Book. There are very few games that manage to make their codex entries relevant and interesting to read without making them mandatory readings. And I think Black Book is one of those games. But what about the gameplay itself? What about the card mechanics? Well, for starters, it's not derivative of Slay the Spire or Monster Train, and that all by itself is a victory. That all by itself deserves commendation, because that's rare in this genre. In this game, you have regular combat encounters and puzzles. And puzzles are similar to the ones you have in Thronebreaker. You also have many secondary mechanics that don't have to do with the deck building aspect of the game, but do add to the immersion aspect. For example, you can play Durak with some of the NPCs. And Durak is a traditional Russian card game that resembles the Spanish Brisca, for those who know, or the Italian Briscola. Kind of like reverse Brisca. Yes, it's... Let's say that your knowledge of Brisca is going to help you here, if you know how to play that game. One thing that I really like about Black Book is the role its maps play in the experience. Because maps in this game don't feel like a series of nodes that you have to overcome in order to progress further towards a final encounter. You get an actual feeling of adventure from visiting the various locations of the game and talking to the people to gather information about how to break this, that, or the other curse, or about how to kill this or that demon, etc. But almost every location requires you to defeat a group of enemies, so in that sense, I guess that at its very core, it's still like your Slay the Spire map, only with a much more attractive veneer of lore and story that feels very role-play-y, and I think that's amazing. Black Book does have its shortcomings, however. One of them has to do with the unfortunate decision that the devs made to go down the character animation path for many of the game's bits. For example, rather than having clickable zones in a still image for exploration activities, for all those parts in which you have to piece together a mystery or a crime scene, so to speak, you have the main character walking about in a 3D space. And that's fine, that doesn't look bad. These scenes and these animations feel simple and minimalistic, but they are still consistent with the game's look and feel. It's cool. But this game has some pretty intense story moments, and they are usually delivered in cutscenes. And these cutscenes don't come off as simple or minimalistic. They come off as poorly made. They feel like the devs couldn't handle the animations, which is a little bit immersion breaking. Also, the game's card mechanics are pretty good, but they are a little bit on the simple side, and that makes the game feel a little bit too easy. True, this game is not meant to be about the challenge, but it seems like a little bit of a wasted opportunity because the game's combat feels fresh and it is fun to play. Also, while the premise of the story is good, great even, impressive even I would say at times, the writing itself feels like it was done by people who are writing enthusiasts rather than writers. People who had a good idea but didn't quite know how to make it happen. It feels as though they feared the player was not going to be able to piece together stuff from the context, so they over-explain things and reiterate a little too much over stuff that you have already seen and that you already know. Although, there is a chance that I'm getting this impression because I played the game in English and maybe a little bit of the story got fucked in translation, or maybe it was straight out poorly translated, but I still think there's a good chance that it's just not very well written. Still, I discovered this game just this year, and it has been one of the most pleasant surprises of the year so far. So this one is going to go into the good tier. Coming up next is Cobalt Core, a game that we have played in Card Battler Saturday, and it's pretty good. It's an encounter-based game, but I think that it has a little something for normies, mediums, and Ryus alike. There is a story, but that's not what the game is about, and you're probably not going to pay attention to it beyond the first few runs. So you have these little guys on the left, these little cutie guys here, and a series of spaceships down here. And you can combine these things however you choose. And this is simple and effective, but also very robust strategically at the same time. Because these little guys have their own specialties, and each of these ships has its own strengths and weaknesses. And beyond the hard difficulty level, you are going to need to think of an overarching plan for the entire run and choose the combination of crew members and ships that best suits said plan. Yes, this game has clear Slay the Spire influences, but combat encounters feel more puzzly and tactical. There is a lot to consider at all times. One of you described this game as cozy over on Card Battler Saturday, and yes, the aesthetics, the soundtrack, and even the overall ambiance of the game is cozy, I guess. But the harder the difficulty level, the more you are required to analyze every tiny moving part that this game has. There is a huge difficulty spike between the harder and hardest difficulty levels, and I know I sound like a total normie, and I probably am, but that's how it felt to me. I burned through the normal, hard, and harder difficulty levels in an afternoon, but after many days I'm still struggling to beat the game in the hardest difficulty level. The game has only one boss per act, and I think every encounter-based card battler worth its salt should have 3 or 4 alternating final bosses per act. This is, however, one of the few games on this list that I keep coming back to, and that's always a good thing. Also, Cobalt Core has an absolutely killer soundtrack, and one of its songs has been living rent-free in my head for weeks. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I like it. I do like this song a lot, and I think this one deserves to be in the good tier. Also notice that I am kind of dragging the games within their tiers, because also the closer they are to the left, the better they are. Because they may belong in the same tier, but also some games are better than others. So it's also a way for me to rank them within their tier, to put them closer to the left or closer to the right. This means that I think that Black Book is better, would come ahead when compared to Cobalt Core, although they are, of course, very different games. Anyhow, coming up next is The Corpsemen. And this one came out of early access 2 or 3 days ago, at the time I'm making this video. But I'm not sure it should have come out in its present state. There are still a few game-breaking bugs, game-ending bugs even, as it is now. But it is an interesting game though. It's a party-based game that draws heavy inspiration from Slay the Spire. It has decent card mechanics, decent cross-character synergies. Sorry, maybe not decent cross-character synergies. It's more like your party of animals actually feels like a party in which each character has a role to play. Or at least that's how I played it, and it worked. I had one animal doing all the tanking, and tanking feels good in this game, because you have cards that taunt all enemies and give extra armor, for example. So I had this one animal doing the tanking, I had one of them doing most of the damage, and the other one doing a little bit of everything. A little bit of crowd control, a little bit of damage, a little bit of moving cards around, etc. This game's unique value proposition is that you can build your own animals from scratch by stitching together body parts a la Victor Frankenstein, which I think is pretty cool. I think it had great potential, because as you play the game and get further and further into it, you get more powerful body parts, with which, in theory, you can create more powerful animals. However, one of the big problems this game has is that you don't get enough information about what each body part does, aside from this little icon here. And this is incredibly frustrating, because it feels like you're just out there farming some parts and buying some others to build what in theory is supposed to be a superior animal that you're going to bring out Grand Messenger style for when the real tough bad guys come along. But you do so blindly because you don't rightly know what these parts do. In Everspace 2, for example, you start with a shitty spaceship, but there are better spaceships out there for sale that you can buy if you have the money. But for a long time, because you're going to be a broke-ass SOB, you're only going to be able to do window shopping. But all these ships that you can buy have stats that you can see. So you can tell yourself, man, when I get rich, I'm gonna buy this spaceship right there, because it does this and that, which is exactly what I want. But now imagine that you see all these cool looking spaceships. You can see that they are pricier than your own, but the specs are all blurred out. Well, that's how Corpsemen feels with its animal parts. And the worst part is that building new animals isn't really necessary. I'm on my first playthrough, only 9 hours in, and I was crushing it left and right until I got a nasty game-ending bug that almost made me quit the game. And after 9 hours, I've completed 44% of the achievements, and I'm even doing hellish maps, which are perfectly doable. And I'm only 9 hours in, and I think the hellish maps are the greatest challenge this game has to offer. So I think this game is a little bit too unbalanced in the player's favor. And it does take its sweet little time to get going. There's a lot of JRPG-ish pointless bullshit and over-tutorializing that you need to go through at the beginning of the game before you finally get to sink your teeth into the meat. So for me, while I somewhat dig this game, I think it belongs in the meh tier. And yes, maybe this is a good spot to put. I'm gonna say that maybe Balatro is very well designed and probably deserves to be before these two. Coming up next is Death Road's Tournament. I played this game last year, a year in which we had titles like Colony Ship, Moonring, Baldur's Gate 3, and War Tales, and I'm going to tell you something. Minute for minute, this is the game that I had the most fun with. Way ahead of any of those I just mentioned, I shit you not. This is one of the most fun games that I have ever played. It is an encounter-based game, but I think all types of players are going to have a blast with it. There is a full review here on the channel. Getting into further detail, I'll leave a link to it in the description section down below. But I'll just say that I love that you have different cars and pilots and components that you can combine in all sorts of crazy ways. You have a garage function that allows you to swap components if you wish to try out new things. It's fantastic. However, this is an encounter-based card battler that doesn't have any form of progressive challenge. So there is no major reason for you to continue playing this game after you've beaten it for the first time. Like I said, this game is going to keep you entertained for 2 or 3 days, and it's going to be 10 out of 10 entertainment, and you're going to have a blast with it, I promise. But you cannot milk this game for months like you can with some of the best games here. And that's why it's going to be just shy of making it to the top tier. I loved it. I really did, but I wanted more. I wanted to be able to milk it for a little more. So this is going to go on the good tier, very, very near the top, somewhere here, somewhere kind of in between the good and the great. But I'm saving the great for the great ones. Coming up next is Deep Sky Derelicts. This is a card battler adjacent game because you have to build a deck and optimize it over the course of the game, and you use your deck for combat encounters. But I wouldn't say combat is the focus of the game, or at least not the sole focus. This game features an interesting blend of mechanics, a very interesting blend of mechanics. And if you like each individual aspect of the game and the weight that each of these aspects has in the overall gameplay mix, chances are that you are going to like this game very much. But it's definitely not for everyone. I think they nailed the comic book aesthetics with the art and the vignettes. I think they did a pretty good job with the world building aspect of the game. And the story and quests are also pretty solid for the genre. At the beginning of the game, you and your team are given a main quest and a very good reason to see it through to the end. And you pick up some side quests along the way while you're out and about in town, I guess. It's like a post-apocalyptic space port of sorts. Then you have to go to different planets and explore these areas to get these quests done. Exploration requires energy, and energy is limited and expensive, so you have to make the most out of it every time you go out there exploring an abandoned location. It is a slow burn game. And there is a fairly extensive period of what the fuck is going on here that almost made me quit, if I'm honest with you. But I progressively became more and more invested in the whole deal. And by the whole deal, I mean the gameplay, the overarching strategic aspect of the game, and the story. The card battler aspect of the game is not its strong suit. And I still feel like I'm more excited about the promise of the payoff, because I haven't finished the game yet, than I am about what I'm actually experiencing currently with the game. So for the time being, while I think it is promising, it's going to go into the meh tier. But do take this with a grain of salt. Do take this with a grain of salt, because it can go either way. It can make the jump too good, or it can make the jump too bad, depending on how it turns out. I will keep you posted, of course. Then we have Deliverance and Reign. Deliverance and Reign has two campaigns, Deliverance and Reign. Deliverance, let's say it draws heavy inspiration from Slay the Spire, but it has its own thing going on. It doesn't look the same, it doesn't feel the same, and there are a couple of interesting, unique mechanics. For example, ailments and buffs carry over from one fight to the next, and you can continue to play cards after the encounter is over to prepare for the next fight. And I think that is pretty neat. That's a pretty neat mechanic. You have different champions that you can unlock and play as, and they all have different decks, and they feel different in the sense that it takes some time for you to wrap your head around what each of them is about. And the card mechanics themselves are amongst some of the most interesting on this list. You have mechanics that involve your draw and discard piles, you have clever and original synergies, enemies are varied. It's not bad. Enemies are varied in terms of what they do, not in terms of how they look. It's not bad. Ryus are probably going to spend some time with this game. I can see why they are going to find it appealing. But there is something about this game that makes me feel like the developers didn't care much about the experience beyond the card mechanics. Supposedly there are branching paths, as there are in Slay the Spire and these other games, but the game doesn't even bother to show you a map. When you beat an encounter and there is a supposedly divergent path, you get two windows that pop up on the same screen with poorly written text that boils down to, do you want to go right or left? And I think this is super lazy. It feels like the bare minimum effort, and honestly, a little bit like the developer didn't give a shit. And then you have the Reign campaign, which is a cheap Monster Train knockoff. There's no way to candy code it. It feels as though the developers made a list of all of Monster Train mechanics and tried to cram them into a game that really didn't need them. And they also didn't care at all about the presentation of these features. They are all crammed together in ways that don't make much sense, in poorly designed menu screens, as though they had to get that out of the way. Oh damn, we are missing this mechanic. Where do we put it? In the same menu that you have this other mechanic. And this makes this campaign feel not great. It's not bad, but it feels too derivative of Monster Train, and it feels like a lazy copycat. I'm actually shocked at how sloppy and at how much of the presentation aspect of this game feels like the bare minimum effort in this title. Because these are the guys who made Defend the Rook, which was awesome. That game had cohesive art, every feature had its own screen, it was beautiful to look at, and it was fun to play. Fun as hell, actually. Actually, the more I talk about it, the more I want to play it again. So I really don't know what happened here. I guess if you wanted to make a good case for Deliverance and Reign, you could say that for the price, you get a taste of two of the best games in the ballpark, which are not these ones, but what two of the best games in the ballpark are like, let's say. But if you wanted to make a case against the game, you would only need to point out that it feels crude, derivative, especially the Reign campaign, and very poor on the production end of things. Nonetheless, this one's going to go in the meh tier because the mechanics are actually good. It's gonna come after all these other titles, but I think it still deserves to be in the meh tier. Then we have Dragon Eclipse. Dragon Eclipse was published by Awaken Realms, the guys who've also given us Tainted Grail Conquest, which we are going to be talking about later on, and Tainted Grail The Fall of Avalon. both of which are dark and gloomy, and that's why this title feels like an odd addition to their catalog. Dragon Eclipse is an encounter-based game. There is a lot of meta progression, but I'm not sure who this game is for. I don't know if it's trying to be challenging and appeal to the Ryus. If so, they failed miserably. I don't know if it's trying to be immersive, or if it's trying to bring the card battler genre to Pokemon fans, but I'm also not sure it's succeeding all that much. It's still in early access and there are a few promising ideas here and there, but I'm not sure it's heading in the right direction. I recently played the new patch, and instead of fixing some stuff, they made it worse, I think. I like that you can roam around the map and decide which areas you want to access by engaging in the corresponding fight. I like very much the reward system. I think they have something good going on there, but I dislike the aesthetics. I think it's trying too hard to be cute and failing miserably at it. I think that your little crew members and NPCs in Cobalt Core have more personality. My problem with this game is different. It doesn't have to do necessarily with the aesthetics. I don't think the encounters are fun. You do play some actions, and there are some ways to make your characters execute their attacks, but I don't like that a lot of what they do when the turn is over. I don't know, it's not particularly fun. Also, as of now, there are ways to cheese this game. There are ways to hyper-focus on this guy and use skills that synergize dynamically and end up generating broken amounts of block. So it's still in early access, and there are a couple of things to like about this game, but as of now, I'm afraid it's going to go in the bad tier. I'll keep you posted, of course, but this is not a very good game. Gordian Quest is coming up next. This is an interesting title that I suspect many of you guys are going to be immediately interested in. Gordian Quest sits in a sweet spot exactly in the middle between card battler and RPG. And I'm talking CRPG, like old school D&D shit. First, characters work like classes in this game, and some of those are very D&D. You have a wizard that has magic missiles, for example. I rest my case. And you also have other types of magic users like clerics, warlocks, golem masters. You have classes like bards, monks. This game also has a system of attributes that's similar to the one in D&D. You have attributes like strength, intellect, agility. And as it happens in D&D, every 2 points that you put into any of your attributes adds a +1 modifier to said attribute. And this modifier gets added to those cards as an extra point of damage or healing or block, depending on what the card does. Cards are color-coded. Green cards are agility-based cards, for example. Blue cards are affected by your intellect modifiers. Red cards are affected by strength, so very D&D. Modifiers are also used in skill checks, because this game has scripted events along the lines of your scripted events in Pillars or Pathfinder, etc., and they usually involve some form of skill check. And I think all of this is going to scratch some of that pre-5th edition D&D itch that some of you guys have. Also, each character has various decks that you can choose from, and these decks are clearly meant to work like archetypes do in D&D. And you can even multi-archetype later on in the game if you wish. You have inventory slots in which you can equip weapons, armor, amulets, potions, etc. Weapons have different qualities, and they also have sockets, and over the course of the game you find gems of different quality that you can embed into them and unembed also. Very important. So it's pretty cool. Another RPG thing that this game has that you don't usually find in card battlers is talent trees. Each character has his or her own talent tree. Most of the talents that you can acquire on these talent trees don't go beyond your typical lazy ass flat bonus to X or Y attribute. You do have the ability to acquire cards that aren't part of your chosen deck, and that makes it a little bit more interesting. You can also unlock extra talent trees that you can couple with your first talent tree in different ways depending on which skill you want to have access to sooner. It's also very CRPG that you choose one of these characters as your MC, but over the course of the game you get to meet and recruit the others. And at any given time, you can go back to your stronghold. Well, so long as you're not in combat, of course. You can go back to your stronghold and swap around your party members as you wish. You navigate the world by clicking on nodes on a map, and some of these nodes are dungeons, and some of these dungeons have hidden rooms, though I do use the term hidden rather loosely. There is an overarching story that begins with your typical local zombie trouble and then escalates to become an epic adventure. And I also use the term epic very loosely here. And there are story events that entail skill checks and decisions that can take you one way or the other. That usually entails one combat encounter that's a little bit harder, or two combat encounters that are a little bit easier. Combat encounters take place on a grid, and there are environmental hazards and obstacles such as traps, pools of acid, piles of rocks, etc. And that adds a little something extra to the combat. And this is needed because your cards aren't all that impressive. You don't have deep tactical card mechanics as you do in some of the best games on this list. But then again, this game has a lot to sink your teeth into other than its cards. And these things are very RPG-y, which I like, of course. This game, however, has three very big problems the way I see it. First, the story is the paragon of genericness. I didn't know what the bad guy wanted to accomplish or why. None of the NPCs had anything remotely resembling a personality or anything to tell you about what the great threat looming in the horizon meant to them. Your companions didn't seem to have any motivation or purpose to tag along for the ride. Nothing was remotely interesting to me in any way. And the problem is that this game tries to sell you the story as something big and relevant. The story is supposed to provide you with reasons and motivations for you to do the shit that you have to do in the game. And for me, it failed miserably. I found myself speed clicking through every dialogue, not really giving a shit about what anyone had to say. Second, there are too many fights, too many of these mini maps, and too many dungeons that feel exactly the same. You can skip some of those, but if you are someone who likes to keep his or her character at the maximum possible level at all times, this game is going to get boring at some point. And third, the game is just too freaking easy in all of its difficulties. Yup, I can see seasoned D&D players and seasoned card battler enthusiasts alike absolutely crushing this game. I mean, I'm no expert in either of these genres, and I pulverized it. And those are big negative points, I'm not going to lie. I still think the gameplay mix is a match made in heaven between the RPG and the card battler genres. It is still very enjoyable, and this alone makes this game worthy, in my opinion, of being in the good tier. Still worthy of being in the good tier, and I'm gonna put it somewhere here. Coming up next is Griftlands. A few weeks ago, when I was showing this game over on Card Battler Saturday, I thought it was a pretty good game. 2 weeks ago, I thought it was a very good game. And right now, I think it's an excellent game. I'm strongly considering to make a Ye Old Gamer Recommends video, because this game ticks almost all the boxes of the things that I want to see in an RPG, and it isn't even an RPG. In fact, it does many of these things better than the vast majority of games that are coming out these days, RPGs included. First, the writing in this game is excellent. Excellent. The people who wrote this game are clearly not amateur hacks. They know how to write characters, they know how to write conflict, they know how to handle pace, they know how to handle plot point and pinch point. Really, really good stuff, guys. The stories in Griftlands, and yes, there's more than one, remind me of the good old days when we had simple, straightforward, stories about revenge that were thrilling and entertaining, but also thought-provoking and inspiring. Griftlands also nailed the world-building aspect of the game, and it does so in a way that is lean and seamless. There is not a single information dump in the game, and still the world feels vast and complex. It feels like a world that has existed long before you walked into it. There is also a lot of player agency in this game. At the end of the game, you get a succession of stills, similar to the one you get in Fallout, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see that all of the stills that I got were the result of my decisions over the course of the game. In fact, I played the same character again, which is something that I rarely do, and took different decisions and forged different alliances to see how things would turn out. And I got almost completely different stills by the end of my second playthrough. Also, over the course of the game, you trigger various random events that have an impact on combat and even on the story, and that makes each run feel fresh and exciting, even if you are playing a story that you have already completed. The second time I played the game, for example, I saved an animal from a much larger predator, and he joined me as a party member. I had already completed the game once by that time, and I didn't even know that permanent party members were a thing in this game. And I even trained and leveled up the little dude to make him more efficient. It is a story-driven card battler, and I think it's meant to appeal to filthy normies and mediums. But it also has an unlockable combat encounter-based mode that I think is going to keep Ryus entertained for a day or two at least. As for the card mechanics, they are surprisingly deep for a game that's not an encounter-based card battler. You have two types of encounters, by the way, negotiations and fights, and they have their own unique mechanics, and both of them are great. Each character has his or her own deck that has 100% character-specific cards, and each deck has one or two viable strategies with pretty cool synergies. Card mechanics aren't as complex or as deep as the ones you have in Beneath Oresa, or some of the other games that we're going to talk about, but within the subgenre of story-driven card battlers, they are some of the best, if not the best. So this one's going to absolutely go in the good tier, and very near the top. I would say it's rubbing shoulders with Death Roads. It's borderline great. It would go here if we had another tier. But like I said, I am reserving the great tier for those games that are la crème de crème, so to speak. Then we have Hadean Tactics, which should have been called Hideous Tactics in my opinion. Yeah, this game isn't great, or good, or meh for that matter. In this game you choose a character and a specialty, like you do in most of the games on this list, and you have an isometric grid in which you and your units do battle against the bad guys. So the game mechanics go a little bit like this. You can choose and play cards on your characters, your units, or your enemies. And once you do these things, you hit the end turn button, and there is an auto battle sequence that takes place in which your enemies and your allies duke it out in a chaotic frenzy. But first, the game does not telegraph what your enemies are going to do during the round. Second, you don't really have control over your units during this auto battle phase. That's why it's called auto battle. And third, it just doesn't feel good to play. Also, production values feel just too crude and amateurish overall. It's just not worth the price of the admission. And it's not worth the price of the admission because look at this. We've, 28 games here? Many of which go for $8, $9, or $10, which is what this game currently goes for on Steam with a 40% discount. And the way I see it, there is no universe in which anyone would rather play this game than Death Roads or Cobalt Core. So this one is going to go, unfortunately, into the bad tier, and it's going to be at the very bottom for the time being. Then you have Inscryption. I've talked about this one previously here on the channel, and it is a hard title to appraise as a card battler, because as a card battler, Inscryption is mediocre. Meh, really. But many people out there got their first taste of the genre with this game due to its popularity, which I think is tremendously misleading. This game is for filthy normies, if we measure it with a tape of challenge. It's very easy to cheese in both of its presentations, and its card mechanics are a little bit on the shallow side. They're not terrible. They are not terrible. But it's cheesable. This game is easily cheesable. The game has two variants. A roguelike deck building variant that you play in Acts 1 and 3, which somewhat resembles Slay the Spire, and a variant that is more like a single player trading card game like Magic the Gathering or Gwent, in which you have different families of cards that work like colors do in Magic the Gathering. You collect booster packs as you explore the game's locations and win encounters, and you can edit your deck, in this presentation at least, much like you do in trading card games along the lines of Magic the Gathering. But neither of these two variants is particularly challenging, even with all the ad hoc weird conditions that some of the encounters have. Despite all of this, I would still recommend this game to any and every type of gamer. In fact, this is a game that you have to play before you die. It's a holy shit type of game that will not leave you indifferent by the time you finish it, believe me. The narrative aspect of this game is fucking genius. And not because of the story itself. Don't get it wrong. It's not like, oh, the story is good, so big deal. No. The story is good, yes. But the way in which it brings you into the narrative, not your character, you, is fucking incredible. If you like Twin Peaks, Mulholland Drive, or David Lynch in general, you're gonna love this one. This one's going to go into good tier. Somewhere, yeah, I guess here. If you want to play a game with unexpected twists and turns, this is the game for you. If you are looking for a challenging card battler with deep strategy and tactics, then no, this is definitely not the game for you, if that's the case. Coming up next, we have Journey to the West. This game's real title is Divinity Chronicles Journey to the West, but it seems like everyone and their mom call it simply Journey to the West, so that's what I'm going to call it. I've already said it here on the channel, this game is a shameless clone of Slay the Spire. Yeah, it does have minions and companions, which you didn't have in Slay the Spire. Each character has its own story, which wasn't a thing in Slay the Spire. And there's a survival mode that's more like a puzzle mode. And this is probably the one thing that's remotely unique about this game. But it's still a shameless copycat. It's not a bad game, but it takes all of its core mechanics and concepts from another game as they are. And I have very little respect for games that do this. It does have, however, one of the best soundtracks on this list, but it's still not enough for me to put it higher than the meh tier. It's gonna go all the way to the bottom, because all these other games have something that is either very solid, like card mechanics here, or original, or inspiring, or yeah, different. This game has nothing. Then we have Knock on the Coffin Lid. Yep, that's the name of this game. Knock on the Coffin Lid. This game's premise is that you die by the end of the tutorial mission and you are brought back to life by some mysterious dude so that you can relive your last moments and piece together what happened before you died. And in doing so, you start to dig out obscure details about the people who sent you on this glorious quest. People who were supposed to be all good and righteous. So basically you start to figure out why you really died and who's behind it. It's cool, it's pretty cool. Gameplay wise, Knock on the Lid is a little bit too derivative of Slay the Spire, but it has its fair share of unique mechanics and the story is both funny and serious at the same time. And it also features decent enemy variety, and the encounters are fun to play as well. You also have an inventory mechanic, and you can equip items on your character, and it's good because these items often give you cards, and there is a build aspect to the gear that you get, which is super cool. Also, every piece of gear that you equip shows on your character, and I know that some of you are going to love this. The game looks good too, and it doesn't feel like it was made by one dude or by a group of struggling developers who had to take on duties that they weren't qualified for. It feels good to play, it has good visuals, it has nice maps, good voice acting when there is voice acting, great user experience. It's a solid game. There is one mechanic, however, that bothers me tremendously about this one. You have meta progression checks, so to speak. There are some challenges that are designed for you to fail them unless you have unlocked the one thing that beats them, and this sucks so much ass. It's also very pricey compared to some of the other titles on this list, though it did come out this year, it has to be said. I'm not going to put it in the bad tier because I like the premise and the card mechanics are better than they are in Across the Obelisk. And in all honesty, I think I need to play a little bit more to see if the story aspect pays off and to see if I find a comfortable spot between meta progression and challenge. But for now, it's going to go into the meh tier. But this one can still make the jump to the good tier or the bad tier. It's not out of the question. Coming up next is Marvel Midnight Suns. This is a card battler adjacent game. You have a deck, you draw cards from it, and they cost energy to play. You also have all the typical deck management features that you have in card battlers, and you have a lot more control over how you build your deck. Encounters are a bit different from your typical card battler encounters though. Combat takes place in 3D areas where there are environmental hazards and there are objectives that you need to complete. This game got its own review on the channel. I did not like it at all. I thought the enemy variety was lacking. I felt there were few encounter types, and the game is designed in a way that requires you to play these encounters over and over in order to optimize your deck, which becomes repetitive at some point. I didn't like that you had to fight each boss 3 times because they always lived to fight another day. I didn't like that they got demoted to elite mobs in regular encounters. And almost all of its mechanics were wrapped in a veneer of narrative shit that was not only pointless and mostly irrelevant to the story, but they also made a mockery of the classic heroes, making them look incompetent and petty and robbing them of almost every heroic moment. There are a few things to like about this game. Each hero has unique skills, and all of them were designed with, all of the heroes were designed with 2 possible roles in mind within a party. And though the game is not particularly challenging, and its card mechanics aren't particularly deep, you still have some pretty neat and rewarding cross-hero synergies. The game also requires you to take into account the setting and the various environmental hazards, as well as your enemy's talents, and your own strengths and weaknesses. And not only for the turn that you're currently on, but for future turns. And I admit there is a lot of fun to be had with this. It also has what in my book are great production values. And I've seen some people shitting on this game because of how it looks. But for someone who plays mostly indie games, it looks fantastic. To me, these production values were great. It is a pity though that they decided to shove that irritating story down our throats with all of its goofy ass dialogue, and that they designed it so that you had to farm repetitive encounters to optimize your deck. So for all of these things, this one is going to go into the meh tier, somewhere around here. Coming up next is Monster Train. This is one of the very best games on this list. And I'm not entirely sure it's not the very best game on the list. This is a top tier card battler, and it also has its own video here on the channel in case you want to check it out. This game is an encounter based game, and it has a little something for everyone. Filthy normies are probably going to bail out after they beat the Divine for the first time, but Ryus are going to have a field day, or field month, or year with this one. And the game gives you plenty of reasons to come back for more. There are several factions with their own unique strengths and weaknesses and viable strategies. Each of them has 2 champions, and for every run you get to choose a primary faction and a support faction and a champion to lead them. There's all sorts of crazy combinations and tactics that you can cook up. Deck management features are beautifully, brilliantly presented as rest areas with various facilities, and the card upgrade mechanics in this game are second to none. It's also, in my opinion, the best game on this list when it comes to its record-keeping functions. Look at this beautiful screen. It's like a trading card album that you're going to want to complete. It's got a system of progressive difficulty called Covenant levels, and then you have expert challenges if you're up for the ultimate masochistic challenge. It also has great production values. The monsters are fun, quirky, and even funny sometimes. Cards have their own little animations, and the soundtrack is fantastic. I am a huge fan of this game. This game is a little pricey, probably the most expensive game after Marvel Midnight Suns on this list. But for a game that you are going to be milking for hundreds, if not thousands of hours, I think it's more than a fair price. So this one is going to go in the great tier and all the way to the left. Again, this is splitting hairs. I think if they are here, you can still make a good case why this game is much better than this, but here I think it's very tight. Then we have Nadir. This game tries, guys. It tries. It tries to do something different with its card mechanics. It tries to do something original with its theme. It tries to do something different with its meta progression, but it was clearly made by one guy or by a very small team in which some of the people had to take on duties that they weren't very good for. So you have characters that you can play as that are interesting, in theory. They are variations of real historical figures like Jeanne d'Arc, which I'm guessing is supposed to be Joan d'Arc. You have Vlad, which I think is supposed to be Vlad the Impaler, telling by the art and the little story that you have here, and Hernan Cortés for some reason. And you can tell that they were going for a dark tone with a touch of levity by the text on each of the characters' descriptions, which is cool, but I don't think they succeeded. Not with me, at least. Initially, you only have one type of run with one bad guy, but after you beat successive runs, you'll get the chance to unlock other final demons and runs. And as you descend into hell, you'll run into creatures that somewhat fit the description that Dante's Divine Comedy Inferno dwellers had per floor. Yes? If that makes any sense. And while this is badass in theory, they look like shit in terms of the art. Gameplay wise, the game is pretty much its own thing. It's definitely not trying to copycat anything else. Your cards in this game have two actions or two groups of actions, and they work a little bit like they do in Gloomhaven. When you play a card, the action that applies depends on the opponent's action that you apply it to. And when you earn card rewards, you really earn halves that you can use to craft your card however you wish. And this is pretty cool. Unfortunately, it's not fun to play. I also never felt like I was beating a combat encounter because I had mastered the card mechanics of the game. And this is not a good feeling to have in a card battler. And it's also lacking in the dopamine department. It just doesn't have the oomph that some other games on this list have. Also, the meta progression isn't great. For example, you need to build a certain facility in Nadir to be able to play as Vlad or Hernan. But instead of unlocking these characters by simply finishing a run successfully with a previous character, as it happens in other games on this list, you need to farm resources on successive runs with the same character before you can build the temple or the vessel that allows you to play as any of these guys. So, I'm afraid this one is going to go in the bad tier, but I'm gonna put it here. Then we have Power Chord. Power Chord is a fun game to play. It is a little bit derivative of Slay the Spire, but it's original enough to feel like its own thing. This is a game about a metal band trying to stop metal demons who are coming into this world through some BS dimensional portal or whatever. Combat encounters take place on live stages where there's a crowd and shit, so yeah, it's deliciously over the top. But it is missing a few basic things. This is an encounter-based card battler, the type that's meant to appeal to Ryus. But those guys are after deep card mechanics, tactics, synergies, new refreshing card actions, and all that kind of shit. And this game does not have too much of that. It's not super shallow, but it's definitely not complex. Also, there's only one final boss per act, which means you don't alternate between bosses. And elite encounters don't feel like mini bosses, like they do in Slay the Spire or Beneath Oresa. They are just slightly harder encounter. And card rewards don't feel great or game-changing. We played this over on Card Battler Saturday, and we were rarely interested in any of the card rewards. The only cards that we did take were the ones that we bought at the store. So there's that. I really like the visuals though in this game. And metal is always metal, come on. So of course the soundtrack is one of my favorites. But at the same time, it feels like they played it safe. Some tracks are kick-ass, but they feel like something that could have been AI generated. And there's some AI generated kick-ass stuff. Some headbanging material out there that's AI generated. Frighteningly enough. So Power Chord is going to go into the meh tier for no other reason than the fact that competition is tough, man. It is, however, going to be before every other game on this tier, but it's just not in the same tier as Death Roads or Griftlands or Black Book. Like all these games are better than Power Chord. That's where we're at. Then we have Roguebook. Roguebook is definitely one of the best games on this list. And if we were to judge these games strictly by their card mechanics, it would be on the top tier, for sure. Not too many games on this list are better. Cards are their own thing in this game. They are clever in their design, there are great synergies that are fun to play, and there are various characters who have their own approach to the combat. You also have allies, which are fantastic. It's a fantastic concept. You control a party of 2 characters in this game, and every combination of characters is perfectly viable and unique. Enemy variety is also great, and like it happens in Power Chord, elite encounters in this game do feel like proper mini-bosses. Also, all of the game's mechanics are relevant to the deck building aspect of the game, and that's what you want from random events and secondary mechanics in these types of games. But the most interesting thing about this game is the exploration aspect. It has a very interesting exploration system, and it's designed in a way that will make you think about how to navigate the map in the way that's most beneficial to your deck as it happens. And I think this is very interesting, very fun. This game is fun all the way through. Production values are also pretty good in this game. This is a game for reuse. It's an encounter-based game. It has a proper system of progressive difficulty levels and solid card mechanics. But filthy mediums can also have a good time. I know I did, and I am a filthy medium. I do wish you had many more ways to make your deck leaner. But that is, I think, a minor. Some people are not happy about this. You can check some other comments on Steam or whatever. But I thought the game is perfectly finishable thus far if you know how to deal with this. There are mechanisms with which you can deal with having a bloated deck. It's definitely one of the good ones. And I can even see people saying, how dare you not put this one on the great tier, or at least before this other 2. Well, I just happen to like these other 2 better. And I'm gonna tell you one thing, this is my list, goddamn. I'm gonna put this one is a better card battler game, without question. I just like these 3 more. They're more tailored to what I want. Then we have Rogue Femme. Rogue Femme is a porn game. Yup, we have those on the list too. It was made by one guy. It's free to play, although I think that you can purchase a more advanced version if you contribute to the guy's Patreon or something. It has AI generated art that features centaur chicks with massive knockers and vaginas in weird places, amongst other things. And it is highly derivative of Slay the Spire. It does have a few unique mechanics though. Much to my surprise, you have to think of a long-term deck building plan if you want to beat this game, which is surprising. Card mechanics are of course very basic. At the end of the day, there's nothing that you have not seen done better in other games, many of which are on this list. It's not the worst game on this list though, and I think that's something to ponder. It's an easy game, but I don't think challenge was meant to be the focus of this title. This game is going to go into the bad tier, but I'm gonna tell you something. I would rather play this game than some of the other titles on this list. So there it is. Coming up next, and don't think the irony of the fact that this game is on the same list as the one we just talked about escapes me. But like Iron Man said in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, here's the big one, Slay the Spire. This was not the first card battler we ever had. but it is the Baldur's Gate 2 of card battlers. The Diablo 2 of card battlers, more like. It's that genre-defining title that 90% of the games in the ballpark have tried to imitate ever since it came out, 80% of which have failed, by the way. And for many, this is the GOAT of card battlers. For many, it's the GOAT of roguelikes. And, well, of course, no surprise. But while it's not my personal favorite, it may very well be the best title on this list. It's the perfect game for normies because it is the king of easy to learn, hard to master games. You pick up this game and you start having fun immediately with almost no learning curve. It's also the perfect game for mediums because its difficulty scales smoothly and it offers a challenge all the way through. There's a broad array of mini bosses. There are unlockable goals that you need to complete in order to gain access to the Heart of the Spire. Perfect for mediums. And Ryus are also going to get a run for their money with the Ascension levels. And the value for the prize is second to none. And you can see its influence in just about every card battler there is. Most of the ones that are here on the list drew inspiration from this one. So of course this one's going to go into the top tier and all the way to the beginning, or maybe here, I don't know. It's not a scandal for me if I put it here. Yes, it can be here or here, but it's definitely here. Tainted Grail Conquest. I have the sneaking suspicion, if you have been following along, that you already know how I feel about this game. This is my favorite game on this list, just in case it needs to be said. Is it the best card battler on the list? No. Does it have the best card mechanics? Also no. But the narrative aspect of the game is absolutely mind-blowing. The world-building aspect of the game is absolutely mind-blowing. And the way in which complex themes are woven into the narrative fabric of the game is also mind-blowing. Arthurian Dark Fantasy is not an easy beast to tackle. Very few people get it right. Very few films, very few games, but these guys nail it. They knock that shit out of the park. This game gave me goosebumps. It brought me to tears. It had me wrapped around its gamey finger all the way through, and on top of that, it has an absolutely killer soundtrack. Absolutely killer production values in general. And card mechanics aren't bad either. You have different archetypes that have unique sets of cards, and each archetype has classes that have their own approach to set of cards. They don't look like they are archetypes, but you have like the summoners, that you have the druid, the blood mage, the necromancer, etc. They all are like an archetype that have similar cards or the same cards, but then each of these characters has to be played in a completely different way. It is pretty freaking cool. And this is an RPG, so you have an inventory and runes that you can socket, consumables, NPC that can do things for you and for whom you have to do stuff. It's fucking awesome. So of course it's on the top tier, and for me, remember this is my list, it goes all the way to the very beginning. Then we have Vault of the Void. I'm usually not a fan of pros and cons lists to rate games, but for this title somehow it feels like the best way to go on about it. This game has a lot of good things that make it stand out in the crowd, and also a few things that in my opinion work against it. Card mechanics in this game are ace. It's one of the best titles on this list in this regard. There are various characters for you to play as, and each of them has its own unique mechanics. The Hidden, for example, has subvert mechanics, which can be used with bleed and combo-based tactics. For me, it feels like the silence, poison, and shift tactics in Slay the Spire. But then you have the Tempest, who has fervor and seal mechanics, which work in a completely different way. So this means that you have to wrap your head around what each of these characters do. So every time you start playing with a different character that you have not used before, it feels like a fresh new beginning, which is the same feeling that I got in Slay the Spire, and one of the reasons why I like it so much. But these unique mechanics go beyond what the character does during the combat encounter. It's more than the strategic turnstone of your deck. Some characters, but not others, have talent trees with skills that you can purchase, and these skills synergize with your cards, and I think this is pretty impressive. It's a substantial, significant twist to the formula that card battler enjoyers are already familiar with. There's also a purge mechanic, which opens up a world of possibilities when it comes to resource economics. It's just fantastic. Vault of the Void is encounter based, and it's mostly for reuse. And if you reckon yourself one of those, this is one you absolutely shouldn't pass on. And if you're one of those people whose main problem with the entire genre is that you cannot edit your deck and build it 100% the way you want, then this might just be the game for you. You have a deck and a backpack, and when you get card rewards, they go into your backpack, not your deck. So at any given time you can swap cards around, and there are precious few games that let you do this. Out of the games on this list, only Marvel Midnight Suns, Death Roads, and the variant of the game that you play in Act 2 in Inscryption let you do this. The game also has one of the best soundtracks out of the games on this list, and those of you who like the dramatic, epic, world's about to end type of vibe are going to love this one. There are, however, a few things that I am not crazy about with this game. I personally do not like this little interface here. See, combat encounters in Beneath Oresa and Tainted Grail Conquest, to name a few, feel good to play. There's punch and gravitas to everything you do. But I feel like this interface here reduces combat to something transactional. And it's not like the game's production values are poor. Graphics are pretty, and the game's overall artistic premise is solid. Enemy cards even have these little cool animations, and I'm all about changing things around and breaking away from the all too familiar Slay the Spire presentation. But this feels lacking. I didn't like it. Also, I don't think the game does a very good job at communicating how things work. I never had a doubt about what was going on or why I had died or what had gone wrong in Slay the Spire or Beneath Oresa or Death Roads. Well, maybe Death Roads with one or two things. But here, there was a little bit of what the fuck-itness, yes? Although I think this what the fuck-itness decreases as you get better and understand how things work. This is, however, a really good game. There's no question about it. I'm gonna put it in the good tier, just like, so I like it. I like Gordian Quest a little bit more personally, but this one has better mechanics. I think, now, well, I don't know. It's a shoulder-to-shoulder thing. And the last game on the list is Voice of Cards, Beast of Burden. And this one's shit, guys. I could say that this game falls outside the scope of this list, but that's not true, it's just bad. This game is labeled Card Battler RPG on Steam, and it fails spectacularly as both of these things. This game is on this list almost as a way for me to warn you not to get it. If you ever see it on your Steam page recommended because you have supposedly played similar games, trust me, don't buy it because you haven't played any similar game to this. No game is this shitty in this ballpark. And this is not a genre rife with spectacular games. But this is one of the 3 worst games that I have played in the last 5 years. And it's one of the worst games that I have ever played, I shit you not. First, this game is supposed to be first and foremost about its story, and there's only one thing that I can say about the story.
That is one big pile of shit.
You are a 14-year-old girl who lives in a village, and your job is to protect said village from hideous monsters. Why? Isn't there anyone better suited for this job in the whole goddamn village? Why is she half naked? Shouldn't she be wearing some form of armor or something to protect her from the monsters? Also, she's supposed to be 14. Why does she talk and act like she's 10 years old? And you're telling me that this is the competent, silent, mysterious, badass dude who saves the day with his untold fighting capabilities? Then why is he some anorexic femboy emo kid who looks like he can only kill his own will to live? Nothing about the story or the characters makes sense in this game, and yet, somehow they found a way to make it utterly predictable at the same time. But enough of that. What about the game itself? Well, you are given dialogue options from time to time, but these options are a mockery of the very concept of choice because they all lead to the exact same outcome every fucking time. Exploration is so fucking slow. Combat is so fucking slow. You fight the same enemies again and again and a fucking again. You level up, but you don't get to decide how to spend the attribute point that you earned. You don't get any skill points to spend. There aren't any feats, nothing. You get card rewards every time you win an encounter, but they are presented as 3 mysterious chests, so there's no deck building decision involved. And it's not like it matters anyway, because the cards don't really serve to build your deck in any way. They are just there as skills for you to choose. There are no synergies, there's no overarching strategy for you to build, and anytime there is a boss battle that requires you to do something slightly different, you can only win by playing your cards in a very specific order, but don't worry because the game will tell you exactly what to do when this happens. So yes, it's a monumental piece of dog shit. The music's good, the sound mix is decent, and I guess there are a few treasures and combat encounters to be found wandering off the beaten trail, but these redeeming qualities are only good enough to save it from being the very worst game that I have ever played, but not much more. There's even a time in which the narrator botches her lines, laughs a little at her mistake, and says them again, and this mistake made it into the game. A game published and developed by Square Enix, no less. That should tell you how much they cared about this title. But Alex, come the fuck on. This game was clearly made for 14-year-old girls to fulfill their fantasy. Well, if that's the case, then I seriously question the decision of including in the game this character who whips monsters for her own pleasure and that of the monsters. Even Rogue Femme isn't that kinky. Also $25? Have you guys gone completely crazy? They should be paying me to be playing this utter piece of dog shit. This one is going to go into the ugly tier. A tier that's specially made for this game, it seems. And that's it. Those are the card battlers that I have played in the last 3 years. We have 4 titles in the great tier, 8 titles in the good tier, and 9 titles in the meh tier, and 6 titles in the bad tier, and 1 in the ugly tier. And I feel like I've given birth to an entire town after this one, so it's time for me to go. Oh, if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. And share the video if you thought it was cool. Bye everyone.
You're excused. You can go back to playing video games.